you can't, on one hand, come out with these maximalist demands as a high negotiating position with your allies, and then when it comes to an adversary, Russia, to concede all their demands before you've even got to the negotiating table. I mean, you do that at the negotiating table. You start high and you come down. Each side comes down. Each side concedes. What the Trump administration have done is concede all of those wishes before they've even arrived at the negotiating table. So you really have to wonder what is left to talk about.
Well, let's speak now to Catherine Philp, who's the Times World Affairs editor. She's in Ukraine. Morning, Catherine.
Good morning.
Tell me, first of all, before we talk about reaction in Ukraine itself to what has been said, what do you think we should read into J.D. Vance's comments yesterday at that Munich Security Conference?
Well, J.D. Vance didn't mention Ukraine in that speech, but he has talked about Ukraine before, and he has most famously said about it that he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine one way or another. The fact that he would use a speech at a security conference in the same time frame in which the Trump administration is proposing a hasty settlement, I think underlines that fact. The fact that he found it more important to berate and scold European allies. I mean, perhaps allies is too strong a word these days, European countries, European powers, over addressing the threat at hand. And indeed, the fact that he said that China and Russia were smaller threats to Europe than what is happening in Europe itself. I think that tells you exactly where Ukraine is on his priority list.
What's the reaction in Ukraine when people heard what was said?
I mean, I think that it's impossible really to divorce what Vance said last night from the bigger picture here. And I don't know how much attention really was paid discreetly to his speech, but really the entire fact of what Hegseth said the other day, followed by Trump's words. I mean, I think there's been a lot of focus here really on the warmth of Trump's words about President Putin after his long phone call with him. The fact that he waited to simply inform Zelensky that they were undertaking peace talks over the head of Ukraine. And although there's been some rowing back there in various quarters from the US, I mean, that is still the sense here, a very deep sense of betrayal that after such extraordinary losses and hardship over the last 3 years, that the idea that Ukraine is simply, not important enough to be involved in deciding its own fate. I think that's come as a tremendous shock here.
Mm. I also wonder how much, in your assessment, we should take what US officials, whether it's Pete Hegseth or whether it is J.D. Vance, say literally, and how much of this is about, in your view, spreading a bit of confusion, a bit of doubt to maybe kind of get leaders on the back foot to start a negotiation, whether that is with Putin, whether it is with European leaders over tariffs. I'm just wondering if it's that, or if this is, in your view, more about maybe the US and European nations drifting apart on values.
Oh, I think it is. And I think that, for the UK in particular, and I've thought this for some time now. I mean, this was one of the issues that was inherent in the entire Brexit campaign, and this notion that leaving Europe, we could cleave closer to the US. I think there was too little consideration of actually where Britain's values lie, and that they are more closely aligned with the European continent than they are with the United States. We talk a lot about whether to take Trump, literally, seriously, but not literally, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you look at Trump's recent negotiations, such as they are, his maximalist statements over tariffs that he's then, managed to, he made those very maximalist demands of Canada and Mexico, and they really sort of managed to essentially fool him by restating positions that they already had and they were already undertaking, and making allowing Trump to think that it was his idea and that he had made a success of it by just stating them. Now, I would contrast that very, very sharply with what he said about Russia and what others in his administration have said about Russia over Ukraine. You can't, on one hand, come out with these maximalist demands as a high negotiating position with your allies, and then when it comes to an adversary, Russia, to concede all their demands before you've even got to the negotiating table. I mean, you do that at the negotiating table. You start high and you come down. Each side comes down. Each side concedes. What the Trump administration have done is concede all of those wishes before they've even arrived at the negotiating table. So you really have to wonder what is left to talk about.
Catherine, thank you so much. That's Catherine Philp, who is the Times World Affairs editor. Let's speak now to John Foreman, who's former UK defence attaché in Moscow and Kyiv. Morning to you, John. Hi, John. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
I can hear you now. Fantastic. What did you make of JD Vance saying that the threat to Europe is coming from within rather from the likes of Russia and China?
Well, I think he's been fairly consistent. I think that was a speech really for domestic MAGA audiences, showing Vance and the Trump team going to Europe and telling the weak Europeans as they see it what they think of them. I mean, Vance has made similar comments in the past about Europe and the risk of immigration and the natural allies and parties on the right. But I think more the business that Vance, I'm interested in, is what's going on off stage. Obviously, he met Zelensky yesterday. The Secretary of State Rubio's in town. The negotiator or the envoy on Ukraine, General Kellogg, is in the room as well. So I think we have to sort of separate slightly the rhetoric. Obviously the speech went down like a cup of cold sick, and actually what's going on off stage.
You think it's a different message off stage?
Well, I think, it's been a busy week, hasn't it? We've had the Hegseth statement about US, should we say, disengagement from Europe, and also that Europe needs to step up for more its own defence, that they want a peace deal done with Russia on the Ukraine. Then we had Trump's comments, and now this. So I think there's, as I think Catherine was saying, it's not very fluid about the message. But I think the direction's clear, that Trump has been clear from the beginning that he wants to deal on Ukraine, and he wants Europe to do more. And I think that some of that was consistent with what the Biden administration has said, and actually what Obama has been said before that.
We said earlier that President Zelensky is addressing the Munich Security Conference later on. How, in your view, having worked in Moscow, having worked in Kyiv, do you think Zelensky should play this? Because this is a fine line to tread, isn't it?
Yes, and I was told that Zelensky had difficulty in striking up a warm relationship with Trump, in a similar way that Trump says he has a warm relationship with Putin. But I think what's been clear the last couple of days is Zelensky's been quite canny. They said, I will deal with Americans, and we've seen that with the Vance, and that's obviously the message he's put across. Then the Europeans, and once the Americans and the Europeans, he's spoken with them, that only then will Ukraine be prepared to talk to Russia. He's also insisted rightly that Ukraine must be at the table, not on the menu, that only Ukraine can decide. But I think if you look back on Zelensky's comments last year, he's indicated some flexibility in his position about NATO membership immediately, or in terms of territory in the east. It wasn't this absolute shock that some people in Europe have been pretending to have. We've known for a while that Ukraine's not getting to NATO because there's no consensus inside the alliance. And we know from last year that there's recognition that Ukraine can't recapture its territories. So I think those are realities. And actually, Putin has actually given up some of his maximum positions already to agree to talks with Trump. So I think it's very fluid. I think for Zelensky, it's an extremely difficult position for him to be in, but he's quite a wily character. And I think all eyes on what he says today, and I think he'll restate those positions.
What do you make of the difference in response from European leaders generally being openly critical of Trump and what has been said versus, for example, Keir Starmer, who we know has asked if he can go to the White House, looks like he's going to be going by the end of the month. He has been strong, Keir Starmer, in saying we think that Ukraine should join NATO. they should be on the path to that, which obviously is against what Trump says. Who do you think's playing that better, the European leaders or Keir Starmer?
Well, just on the Starmer comments, what Starmer was doing is restating what was agreed by the Allies in Washington last July. That they said that Ukraine's future is in NATO and that Ukraine's path to NATO membership is irreversible. That's fantastic. But at the same time, the Allies didn't do anything to start the membership process for Ukraine. They haven't done that since the first time when I was in Ukraine. The NATO allies agreed that, quote, Ukraine will be a member of NATO. And there's no consensus. The US doesn't agree, Germany doesn't agree, Spain, Hungary, Belgium, others. They hide behind, and Turkey. They hide behind that American statement because they don't want Ukraine in NATO, because they don't want to be fighting the Russians. So I welcome Mr. Starmer restating that position, but actually it's not really it's not a split for the American position. What the Americans has said, if Hegseth said, is that Ukraine won't be NATO as a part of this negotiating process, but he held the door open for a longer term accession. Now, who's playing it better? I think Macron's played it well, and I think Starmer has not. There's been less of the sort of hysteria around the comments that Trump's made or statements, and also Hegseth. I think it's very wise for Starmer to go to Washington to speak to Trump in person, to set out the UK position, which is no, you don't talk about Ukraine without Ukraine. Europe needs a voice, and the UK needs a voice if it's going to be providing European peacekeepers. That the deal can't be done over the head. So I think dialing down the rhetoric, dialing back from the outrage and the cause of appeasement and surrender, I think it's really unhelpful at this stage. We all know that a peace deal was likely to come in 2025. I think let's do the work in private, not shout at each other across the Atlantic.
John Foreman, thank you for speaking to us this morning. I'm grateful to you for your time. He is former UK Defence Attaché in Moscow and Kyiv. We also heard from Catherine Philp, who is the Times World Affairs editor.